Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're going to talk about the invasion of the Philippines. Not the American invasion, but the Japanese one. We're talking about this today because we have a very special speaker coming on board on December 4th. There's a link in the description to that event, but if you are interested in the Philippine experience during World War II, Celeste Ramos-Martin is coming on board to talk about her family's experience in the Philippines during the war. Her dad, Ben, was 11 years old and playing soccer when the Japanese started bombing Manila. He survives the entire Japanese occupation, and Celeste is in the middle of writing a series of books called the Children of the Pearl series, in which talks about her family's experiences in the Philippines during the Japanese occupation. So she is coming out on December 4th to talk about that, and there's a link in the description with more details. I will be there, and I'd love to see you there too. The United States takes the Philippines from Spain during the Spanish-American War in 1898. The United States is beginning to expand into a colonial empire, and while many of the European powers have already claimed European possessions in the major island groups and the Asian mainland, the United States is late to the program. So there's not much left that hasn't already been claimed by other white people. So, unable to break into China, which is a huge economy even back then, the United States decides they want to base near China. And so the Spanish having control of the Philippines and also a series of islands, namely Wake and Guam, which connect the recently annexed American colony on Hawaii with the rest of the U.S. mainland via this nice route with just enough space in between for coaling stations. The Philippines seemed like a great place to set up shop, especially given the natural harbor at Manila Bay. So the United States takes the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, then fights the Philippine-American War to continue to occupy the colony, and operates out of there. Meanwhile, Japan is also trying to build an empire. As an island nation, they don't have all of the natural resources they need to be a first world power. And so they begin a series of colonial endeavors in the islands of the Pacific to basically protect the way to Japan, but also on the Asian mainland. This includes a war with Russia. They take Korea, they take Manchuria, they take a lot of China during this time period, and they're looking at Siberia as a place with a lot of resources. However, a couple of forays into eastern Russia shows that the Russian army is too much for the Japanese army on mainland Asia to deal with. So they start looking around where else can they get these resources, and the Dutch East Indies have a lot of what they need. Moreover, with World War II already begun in Europe, the Dutch can't send any more resources to the East Indies because they are being occupied by Nazi Germany. So Japan has this colony that's basically free for the taking. The only issue is the United States, which has already been opposing Japanese action in mainland Asia, has this Philippine colony directly between Japan and the Dutch East Indies, along with the major fleet base at Cavite. So Japan has to neutralize this to prevent the American fleet from using it as a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. And so begins with Japan attacking the Pacific Fleet to neutralize it so it can't come over and relieve the Philippines, and then attacking the American possessions of the Philippines, Wake, and Guam, along with other European possessions like Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Indonesia. And they're doing all of this primarily to get the oil and rubber resources from the Dutch East Indies, and then to form several concentric rings of island defenses to prevent the Allied powers from being able to easily access what they now call the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, or Japan and her colonies. And it works out pretty well. We all know that the Philippines fall relatively quickly to the Japanese. What we don't remember is this campaign is 6 months long. And the fact that the Japanese are forced to continue to fight in the Philippines prevents them from gobbling up all the islands that they wanted to, which allows the Allies to start just a little bit closer to Japan. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. In the Philippines, it's already December 8th. The Philippines get very early warning that Japan has attacked the United States and that they should prepare for war. The United States has been preparing for war for a while and always expected the first strike to come at the Philippines. There have been a series of plans during the interwar years which seemed to alternate between, the Philippines were just there to hold out as long as possible while the U.S. gets ready for war, or the Philippines can be held indefinitely and the U.S. will send its fleet directly there to use it as a base to end the war in the Pacific as quickly as possible. And by the beginning of World War II, most everyone agrees that the Philippines cannot hold out indefinitely, so they're just there to buy time. However, General Douglas MacArthur is recalled from retirement and sent to the Philippines. He had previously served there before, and his father, Arthur MacArthur, had commanded the Rainbow Army in the Philippines during the U.S. occupation earlier on. So Douglas MacArthur is the natural choice. What I've always found interesting is with World War II going on and German generals perfecting the Blitzkrieg and active fighting going on in Europe, Douglas MacArthur is the highest paid soldier in the world in 1941. MacArthur believes that with enough resources from the United States that he can hold the Philippines indefinitely. And he begins to train Philippine indigenous forces to hold out indefinitely. In particular, the development of the B-17 bomber makes him think that he can strategically bomb Japanese possessions around him, and that will protect the Philippines. However, when Japan attacks, everything that MacArthur was promised was not yet there. He had not been able to fortify the Philippines because of part of the agreements along with the Washington naval treaties. So, in short, the United States is not ready for war. American air commanders, upon hearing of the attack on Pearl Harbor, look at their war plans, the most recent of which is Rainbow 5, and decide, hey, this says that we're supposed to go out and bomb the Japanese, let's do that. Well, they have to get personal permission from General MacArthur. When Pearl Harbor is being attacked, it's the middle of the night in the Philippines, so permission is late in coming, and by the time they're told they can attack, it's not you're attacking at dawn on December 8th. It is you're going to attack at dusk on December 8th. So Japan has a full day to prosecute the war before the U.S. are going to do this air attack. Now, before we get into that, the United States does have some modern assets. They've got 34 B-17s, and they've got 91 P-40 fighters, as well as 152 older aircraft. They have approximately 130,000 soldiers between regular U.S. Army forces and other U.S. Army Air Force, Navy forces, whatnot on the island, but regular U.S. military, long-standing Philippine Defense Forces, and Philippine Reserve Forces that can be called up. The Japanese are outnumbered about 3-2. They're only going to commit about 100,000 soldiers to this. However, they do have 541 aircraft that they're committing to the attack. First thing in the morning, the American aircraft take off just so they're not caught on the ground like the aircraft at Pearl Harbor were. And they circle. And then they run out of fuel. And they're given the orders that they're going to be launching a night attack. So they land to refuel and rearm. And believe it or not, that's when the Japanese attack and pretty much wipe out the entire American Air Force on the Philippines. Before the end of December, the U.S. has virtually nothing flying. So it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that they aren't as supplied as they should be. However, the resources they have are being mismanaged, and the Philippines are not going to hold out forever. In fact, Japan's invasion is so successful that they pull out the frontline units that they have after the end of the first month because they think the battle's mostly won, and recommit those forces to invade the Dutch East Indies well ahead of schedule. Remember, the U.S. has more manpower there, but their equipment is vastly inferior. The Japanese army has been fighting in China for many years at this point. They're experienced and fully equipped, and they're prepared for this fight. The American army in the Philippines, not so much. MacArthur had asked for new M1 Garand rifles, but he's still using World War I era Enfield 1917s. The U.S. doesn't have enough of these to rearm the entire army back home, much less send them to the colonies. The most critical shortage is probably the light artillery that his various divisions should have as backup. So basically, MacArthur just has rifle-armed line infantry to defend the islands with. He's got a lot of coastal artillery pointed to seaward around Manila Bay primarily, but these are fixed positions that are easily attacked by Japanese aircraft once the Japanese quite easily take air superiority. So within the first month, the Japanese have basically been able to perform uncontested landings. They're not actually attacking the heavily fortified Manila Bay. They're landing at other places around Luzon. And because the American aircraft can't contest the landings because they're all blown up on the ground, and because the U.S. submarine doctrine, the next most powerful defensive force in the Philippines was the modern submarine force that was part of the Asiatic Squadron. Well, without air support, the Asiatic Squadron leaves for Australia and the Dutch East Indies, and the submarine force that stays behind is trained through interwar doctrine to be a scouting force. They're not trained to go out and find enemy merchant ships and attack them. So they underperform. They certainly, late war tactics using these same vessels shows that they can absolutely cripple the Japanese economy and armed forces. But in 1941, those lessons haven't been learned yet. So the bombers aren't used effectively, the submarines aren't used effectively, the ships pull out, the other naval personnel grab Springfield 1903s and become an infantry force, as do the Army Air Corps personnel who have now lost their aircraft to service. So things are going very badly, and in the first month, Luzon is mostly overrun. MacArthur audibles from his original plan to hold out in the Philippines forever and enacts War Plan Orange No. 3, a completely obsolete plan at this point, which has his army falling back along 5 defensive positions across Luzon to just hold back the Japanese so that they can stockpile as many supplies as possible on the Bataan Peninsula and on the island of Corregidor, the fortified island in the middle of Manila Bay. So the Japanese are able to push through several of these lines of defenses very quickly and very effectively, and then they decide, we've won. They pull out their frontline units and most of their air support to go attack the Dutch East Indies ahead of schedule. At this point, the units that had been previously designated as garrison units are brought in to mop up. But the United States still has a huge manpower advantage, and there's a lot of fighting around the Bataan Peninsula, and several initial attacks to break through the line are defeated. And basically, the United States and Philippine forces spend the next 2 months, January and February, able to hold off the Japanese. At this point, the Japanese decide they're just conducting a siege, and the Americans aren't prepared for this. They don't have the supplies to hold out indefinitely. And eventually they're forced back to the island of Corregidor, and the Japanese just sit there and wait them out. And on May 8th, after 6 months of fighting, the American forces under General Jonathan Wainwright are forced to surrender. Japanese General Hama insists that Wainwright surrenders the entire American forces in the Philippines, not just the ones under his direct command on Corregidor. And Wainwright, believing that the Japanese will potentially commit atrocities against his forces if all of the Americans do not surrender, does. Why is Wainwright empowered to make these decisions? Well, Roosevelt had ordered MacArthur to escape the Philippines by this point. So MacArthur and other top personnel and Philippine officials and the Philippine National Gold Reserves and everything else is evacuated prior to total defeat. And MacArthur is sent to Australia to prepare setting up that continent as an American base to continue to prosecute the war on Japan. Wainwright is able to hold out for another 40 days, which gives MacArthur time to get ready. And it prevents the Japanese from being able to fully encircle Australia and take that entire country out of the equation. And that's the major success of the Philippine invasion. Japan catches them with their pants down, even though they had forewarning of Pearl Harbor. But they are able to hold out for 6 months. And this is something that we don't see when we read the history books. On May 8th, when the Philippines finally surrender, the U.S. Navy has just finished the Battle of the Coral Sea, also May 8th, 1942. Because Japan is continuing to fight in the Philippines, they cannot go and attack New Guinea and the Solomon Islands as much as they wanted to. Without being able to do this, they don't cut off Australia. The U.S. is able to use Australia as a major base, especially for our submarines, which are going to be able to access the Dutch East Indies and just sink all these oil tankers before they can get to Japan. And it means that the United States can start its offensive at Guadalcanal, a relatively unfortified Solomon Island, rather than having to start it further to the east and then fight their way westward toward Japan, several more island chains. Tragedy of the defense of the Philippines, however, is that the Japanese don't have a culture of surrender under the Bushido Code. And while they expect European forces to surrender under their might, they didn't expect quite as many forces to surrender. And so they were not set up to handle all of these prisoners of war. They had neither the food nor the resources prepared, and so they enact the Bataan Death March, which is going to kill thousands of American soldiers and Philippine soldiers. And then they're going to use these guys as slave labor for most of the rest of the war, and the ones who don't starve to death or killed outright die from disease, and a relatively small number of them, completely emaciated, are left to be rescued at the end of the war.
In 1942, in April, is when the General King surrendered Bataan and started on a death march. The death march was 65 miles, and we didn't get any food or water. We started out with about 9,000, And when they got in the camp, the first camp, Camp O'Donnell, 10 days later, they only had 6,000. Now on the march, of course, without water or food, a lot of them would drop dead. Of course, for me, when I was so weak, I'd just come off the front line. I only had a canteen and a mess kit. And of course, for me, there's a Filipino with no legs trying to make the march. He didn't get too far. And another fellow from my outfit, he dropped down as the truck ran over him. And the Japanese would bayonet guys if they fell to the ground. And they were wild with trucks. If you got close to them, they'd just hit you with a bayonet. So, and then there was quite a few of them that jumped over bridges. And without the water, a lot of them were eating sewer water. So when we got into Camp O'Donnell, the first camp, most of us had diarrhea, dysentery. I had it so bad I wound up in the 0 ward, where maybe 1 out of 100 got out alive. I was so weak, I didn't even sleep in the barracks. I slept next to the latrine. And it's a good thing I did, because they were burying about 100 of dead, so they figured they're going to die anyway. They took them out, some of them were alive even. They just clubbed them over the head and buried them. Filipinos took a bigger loss. They were losing about 200 or 300 a day. So I finally got out of the diphtheria ward. I was one of the few, according to Dr. Bloom, I was one of the few that got out alive. Then I wound up in a blind ward. I got in a blind ward. I get another barracks where there was one guy escaped, and I thought for sure me coming, they knew they were going to pick me, but they already had them picked. So they took the 9 other guys. They had to go out and dig their graves, and then they brought them back and shot them.
My school taught us about the invasion of the Philippines, and that the Japanese take it and keep going, and that's that. I didn't learn until much later that this was a 6-month battle that really affects the subsequent course of World War II. What did you learn about the Philippine invasion in school? Let us know in the comment section down below. Remember, Celeste Ramos-Martin is going to be on board the battleship on December 4th to talk about her family's involvement during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. And if you didn't learn much about this in school, it's a great time to come out and see her talk. We're also going to be live streaming it, and it'll of course be left up on the channel afterwards, so stay tuned for that. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other private businesses and individuals. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to continue to donate to support the museum. You can also help us out by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about our channel and what we're doing. Thanks for watching.